And good morning, everybody. We're live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another week of amazing food safety, amazing food products, all kinds of yummy things that we all eat and enjoy every single day. And part of the difficulty of working in food safety and quality assurance is if you do a good job, people don't notice. But we're here to tell you, Jose and I do notice, and we're very happy with what you do. So thank you for all that you did for food safety this week. If you're new to the chat, pull up a chair. My name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group, and every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, we sit down for an hour and we talk about all things food safety. And what's fun about this is I get to bring an expert on and talk about all these different subjects. And what you'll notice if you're new to the chat, not a lecture. This is meant to be interactive, and we are here to help you and answer your questions on the different topics that we have every week. And so one of the things that we love to do here on the chat to get things started off is list out where in the world you are at. And I'm in Loveland, Colorado, where fall is in full swing, Jose. We've had an unusually warm fall. It's been, I think yesterday it was in the low 80s. Today it's cooled down a little bit, but it's been absolutely beautiful. The leaves, it's been a pretty gradual change on the trees. So our maple trees that we have in our yard are very pretty yellow and reds. It's just very, very nice. So we were a little worried about you, with the hurricane going through down there in the Miami area, but I think everything turned out okay for you, right?
Thanks God. Yes.
Good.
It went up. Northwest of here. So we just receive gusty winds and those crazy rains that last for 5 minutes, and that's it. And
Nice. So one of the things you'll notice if you're new on the chat here as well, so Sai, good morning, is that we have a fantastic group of regulars who join us and participate in the chat. So Austin and Allie and Tim. Tim's home in Nashville. Good. Steve, welcome. Nice to see you as well. So everybody continue piling in here and let us know where you're at in the world. So one of the things for everyone here on the chat, if you're new as well, is Jose is prompting me here, is join us for a drink of your favorite beverage. Cheers. Very nice. Have a light roast Ethiopian coffee this week. So very nice.
Oh, that's the one that you have today?
Yes. It's so much coffee now is they roast it to cinders. It's just very burnt, and the kind of the Starbucks thing. I've always heard, I don't know if this is true or not, that the reason Starbucks has such a dark roast on their coffee is it's to balance flavors, because Starbucks is so huge that you have to roast it to a very high level to balance out the flavors with the different varieties of coffee. Because Starbucks is like McDonald's, right? You want the same experience everywhere you go. And I can only imagine the massive amount of coffee they must buy, right? So
yeah,
craziness. Yeah. That is for sure. So Bob, welcome to the chat. I'm going to hopefully not scare away Bob from the chat here, but one of the things that we've added to the chat here recently, Jose, is the dad joke. Are you ready for the dad joke?
I'm ready.
All right. Here's the paper. All right. Why don't ants ever get sick?
Oh my goodness, you got me. I don't know.
Well, it's simple. It's because they have antibodies.
That joke.
I love that one because it works on both sides, right? So antibodies, and then ant has a body, and it's like, that was my favorite from the last few weeks. That one's good.
Oh my goodness.
Alexis is saying, Starbucks coffee. I'm not a fan of Starbucks coffee either. I never go there. Pizza's pretty good. Yeah, pizza's good. And Ripple Foods recently introduced a plant-based barista product at Pete's that's really good. So if you have a Pete's in your area, definitely try that out. So Jose, you are a busy dude. And so we're always really happy when you're on here. And so you've been learning a lot about regulatory processes and all these type of things. And you and I were chatting here recently. One of the things that you've really been doing a deep dive into is risk and risk assessment, and how that overlays with hazard analysis, which I find absolutely fascinating because it's one of those things, isn't it, where we talk about, oh, well, you need to have a risk-based hazard analysis, but we understand the hazard side of it, but from our conversation, the risk is kind of fuzzy, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. So, Brian, I mean, finally, I'm almost done. I'm doing a master's degree in risk management. And the reason why I signed up for that is because in my mind, I believe that, I mean, we just say, oh, yeah, we have a hazard analysis. Well, what that means, are you doing that correctly? Do you have the right approach? Are you finding the right hazards? I was having a conversation in LinkedIn with, another very intelligent person. I really believe she's very good. And she was saying, risk matrices are not good for me. And when I read that, I say, oh my goodness, okay. Risk matrices pre-made, like the ones that we can access online, yeah, they're not good. And I replied to her saying, well, if we do this properly and we go and use the ISO 31010 and we select one of the techniques there, and we understand what is the goal of the techniques and understand limitations and understand, the pros, well, should not be that difficult to develop an effective risk matrix.
But yeah, it's not.
But what we have right now is not that.
No.
I mean, ask anyone. I'm teaching classes all the time. Guys, how do you define severity? How do you define likelihood, probability? How do you do that? Which are the sources that you find, and tell me how consistent are you in the way that you select severity and likelihood to determine risk?
Mm-hmm.
And people don't know the answer. And we have been using HACCP for what, Brian? 70 years?
Yeah.
I don't know, 80 years, 60 or something like that.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a good point because I mean, when the whole risk analysis and HACCP started off, right, the stories we all know around NASA is it was easy for them to understand the severity, right? Okay, astronaut gets sick in space, they're dead, right? The severities way up high, right? And that was very easy to define. But once you get away from that high level, then it starts getting very vague. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about here today. And Duncan is already kind of jumping in here with points where we're going to be getting to, because Duncan's a smart dude and he knows where we're going with it. So, yep, Duncan, we'll get to your topic here around how do you engage that risk with your program. But before we dive into all of this type of stuff here, Jose, one of the things that you have absolutely drilled into my brain, and it lives there permanently now, is definitions, right? Is how do we define risk? And so you've mentioned ISO a little bit. So what is your definition of risk?
Okay, so now look at this, Brian. The classes that I took they were just amazing. And I'm going to cite the official definition of the word risk from ISO. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to use the ISO 9000, and I'm going to read it because I have that here. Is the effect of uncertainty. Some people use that definition and they add is the effect of uncertainty in the objectives of the company. And which are the objectives of any company manufacturing food? The prevention of adulteration and misbranding. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's not just hazards. If any product in the United States and around the world contains a little piece of hair, the product is adulterated.
Correct.
It's not going to kill anyone, but the product is adulterated by definition because it's not in compliance with its own specification, number one. And number two, because hair is not food.
Right.
Okay. So when we say the effect, that's the effect. Okay. And then uncertainty is the level of our ability to identify those events that will cause whatever we're searching for, whatever we're trying to analyze risk, which in this case is food safety only. We're not looking into analyze the concerns for inclusion of hair, inclusion of food grade grease or food grade oil, because those things are not going to cause illness or injury, even though that the product is adulterated by definition. Okay? So to my point, Bryan, there are two fundamental ways that we assess risk, that we determine risk, that probability portion. And that probability portion comes in, the first way is our job is to look for things that may happen, events that may happen, and will adulterate the food with a hazard, because it's a food safety, it's about safety, it's about hazard. Food safety plan, food safety system, but it's food safety only. So how do you do this? Option number one, you look into the things that already happened to you at the facility. In the last 10 years, we never had an issue with environmental pathogen adulteration. The fact that someone never had an issue with that does not mean that it will not happen in the future. Yeah. Because risk is in the future, not in the past.
Ooh, say that again. Risk is in the future, not in the past. Oh, huge.
So even, that is huge, Bryan, because even though that it never happened to you, that doesn't mean that it will not happen.
Yes. Well, and for me, Jose, that's a perfect encapsulation. What drives me nuts is you'll go in and visit a facility, you're auditing or consulting, whatever, and you start trying to understand their risk. And you'll ask questions like you're saying, and you'll say, okay, well, have you had problems, da, da, da. Well, are you concerned about Listeria? Well, we've never had a problem before.
There you go.
Okay. So you're telling me you're extrapolating past experience into your point, into the future, that because it never happened in the past, it will never happen in the future. If you take one thing away from what we're talking about here today, what Jose just said is it, right? That's super, super important that you understand that.
Yep. And so you are working in the identification of those potential hazards, and I can use also the known or reasonably foreseeable, because at the end it's about the same. And we look into our own operations. Mm-hmm. And people, if they never identified anything, they don't put it in their hazard analysis. They do not understand that the risk is in the future. So mm-hmm. if the risk is in the future, you just need to look outside and see any other company making the same products or similar product to ours. Is there evidence that you're having issues because of environmental hazards? And when you see that, it doesn't matter that it's never happened to you. You need to look into that experience. And because risk is in the future, you're supposed to put that in your hazard analysis.
Yeah. So here's a good example of that for me. And I harp about this all the time on my locals group is I see recalls, Jose, almost every other week for enoki mushrooms. And I'm just like, it's like listeria, enoki mushrooms. And someone had pointed out, I was talking about this on the chat recently, and somebody said, well, it looks like all of these are foreign based. So I wonder if it's something, with these foreign manufacturers that are making enoki mushrooms. I'm like, maybe. But this week, what did I see? An enoki mushroom recall for listeria from a domestic manufacturer. So it's not, right? There is something inherent in growing enoki mushrooms that listeria loves, right? So if I am going to start an enoki mushroom company, I damn well better be figuring out how to control listeria.
Yeah, because there is a lot of information out there indicating that maybe not in the first week, in the first month, in the first year, but at some point, people are going to be sending inoki mushroom to the market that contain listeria,
Right.
monocytogenes.
And
Okay.
really, and I think indirectly around this, right? So we have kind of a working definition of risk in our minds right now with ISO, right? So you had mentioned 31010, so 31,010. And I think too, regulatory agencies understand that we don't have a really good understanding of how to assess risk, which is why they created the draft guidance, which we call shorthand Appendix 1, right? So FDA went through and said, for all these different food categories, so ready to eat granola bars and cakes and you name it, FDA went through and said, here are what we consider to be the physical, chemical, and microbiological risks that you should consider for your products to at least give you a head start. And they've been very clear on this too, saying this is a reference, right? You just can't take this and copy it and say, I'm done. Right? No. Can't do that, right? It's a starting point.
Yes. So let me continue with that source of identification of hazards. So the first one are the things that we know because they happen to us or because they happen to others. Okay? And those are things that if they happen to others or to us, is it possible that those things may happen in the future to us? Yes. Okay. So make sure you put that in your hazard analysis. Okay. That's number one. Number two, we always have the possibility of what is called in risk management, the black swans. Things that nobody saw it coming and they happen. And typically they have very severe consequences.
Yeah.
So those are fundamentally the two sources for those events. Now, I don't want to talk about hazard yet. For those events that will place a hazard into our operations. Okay, events. Now, if we go to 31,010, HACCP is there. HACCP is in Appendix B. And when you read HACCP, it's going to tell you, oh, this risk assessment technique was developed between NASA and Pillsbury to send people to the moon and all the stories that we already know from years. And there are 7 principles, but they have a section, Bryan, listing the limitations of the technique because all of the techniques somehow do have limitations. And if we are assessing risk, I mean, how can we teach a hazard class without indicating the limitations of the technique? I mean, doesn't make any sense. So if you go to the limitations, the first one says that the technique is not helping people identify the hazards. And go to your comment, that's a reason why FDA most likely knew about this, and I'm just guessing, and they say, oh, you know what? We better identify the hazards in our guidance document for preventive controls, which is pretty much mimicking what happened with the seafood HACCP, which all of the hazards of the species, vertebrate or not, and hazard from the process were identified by the FDA since, I don't know, to 96, 97, 95, something like that. So it makes sense to help people identify hazards because it's not part of the technique.
That's a good point. And so from our experience as auditors and consultants, when you start going into a food plant and you start looking at their food safety plan, and I'm sure you've had this experience a lot, Jose, is you get to the hazard analysis and you look at the chart. We're all very familiar with the chart, and it has severity, rating, high, medium, low, likelihood, high, medium, low, and then it gives it a score, and then people look at that, and if you ask the question, well, how did you decide that this was medium?
Yeah.
And you get this look,
Yep.
right? Because they're doing this. Yeah, I mean, it seems about a medium. And that's one of the things I see in food safety plans a lot is you'll say, okay, show me the documentation and the research justification you did to come to
Yep.
that conclusion.
Because actually,
Oh.
Bryan, what you are describing is exactly the next limitation that we are supposed to write down and I'm going to say a table describing, okay, these are the rankings. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, which was the comment that I received in LinkedIn from this very wonderful lady, a very intelligent one. And she said, well, Jose, but the 3 by 3 or 5 by 5 or 3, I don't care. How do you create that matrix? That is 100% up to you. As long as there is a rationale behind each of the levels, that could be 3 or 5 or 7 or 2 or whatever you wish, there must be a rationale. So you describe the score, you describe, you provide a description, a rubric explaining what that level means, and make sure that that level is applicable to your own products and your own processes. Yeah. Because after going through the master, Bryan, I'm not surprised if at some point the matrix for manufacturing fish fillet is going to be different from the matrix of Oreo cookies or the matrix for, I don't know, ready to eat cookie dough or something like that. I won't be surprised. But defining the levels of severity and the levels of probability is critical and is not part of HACCP. It's a limitation of the technique, as well as now that we are in this, approach, in this explanation, if you need to define the different levels of severity and the different levels of likelihood, when you combine them in the matrix, you also need to define the risk, the different levels of risk that you are creating by combining severity and likelihood. And once you define also the risk, you need to determine what kind of controls you are going to associate with each of the risk that the combination of severity and likelihood represent. But we don't have that in HACCP. It has never been part of the class.
Interesting. We have some really good comments going here. So there's some suggestions for using tools. So SWOT, right? Great tool. Yep. I'm not sure what the other one is. Pestle, P-E-S-T-E-L. What is that, Jose? I
don't know. I'm not sure.
So you want to look at it. Is it so in business analysis, it's a framework of external macro environmental factors used in strategic management and research. Wow.
Maybe it's an educated way to exactly identify what's going on.
Yeah, and this is what's so cool about the chat, right? Is we get so many smart people who join us for this with their great ideas. So, so Duncan is saying here, if we went a level further and showed the research and considerations, you'd then also be in a position of saying, and why did you think that was comprehensive and appropriate? And what makes you think you're interpreting the data correctly? Oh, yes. Spot on, Duncan. Thank you.
Yep.
So this may be a little bit too comprehensive, but Larry's asking a question here is, can you show an example of a HACCP risk analysis? That's a lot. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about overall, but.
Yes. I mean, it will take most likely a class or a webinar, and maybe in 1 hour, most likely we're not going to be able, Larry, to go through these. But I mean, the purpose of this conversation is to just have an understanding of what is HACCP and what we're missing.
Yes.
In the implementation of that technique.
Yep. It's like that saying, right? Sometimes you have to be aware that the dog is not barking, right? So what are you missing if you don't hear the dog barking? Francisco's got a question that we may be able to answer is, can you explain differences between risk and hazards?
Oh, that is great. Okay. So I'm going to use this approach. There are, Francisco, events, things that happen in the production of food. Some of those things carry hazards with them. And those hazards are the one that will cause illness or injury. That's a definition of hazard. Okay. Mm-hmm. So our job as risk analysts is to determine the severity and the likelihood of that hazard that we identified in order to understand what is the risk. So the risk fundamentally is the assessment of the severity and likelihood of the hazard. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, Francisco? Let us know.
And so kind of the way I think about this too is car insurance, for example, is mm-hmm. when you buy insurance, you're essentially betting that something's going to happen. And you're saying, okay, I will pay this amount of money on a monthly basis to protect me about this thing that I think may happen. So when you purchase insurance, you're making a personal risk analysis, but yes. The insurance company is making a very sophisticated risk analysis, right? Oh. So when an insurance company asks you questions for your car insurance, they're performing a risk analysis on you. And they have this massive database of information relative to risk. So they'll ask you, oh, okay, Mr. Armentrout, how old are you? Well, I'm in my 50s. Okay, good. You're an experienced driver. Do you have any tickets? Nope, I don't have any tickets. Okay, do you have any accidents? Nope. What type of car do you drive? Where do you live? Do you have any teenage crazy drivers in the house, right? All these type of things. And they plug all this stuff in and they say, okay, based upon our analysis of the risk of insuring you, here's your premium.
Yep, exactly right.
Yep. And if you want to see how successful they are at, go and look at some of the buildings that insurance companies own.
The most advanced risk analysis in all of the different type of companies in the world are insurance companies and banks.
Yes.
Yes. And that was part of a lot of the topics that I covered during the going through the masters. I mean, there was a lot of information about insurance, stocks, stock market, and banks, and a lot of that. And the way that they perform that analysis, oh my goodness, we are in diapers in the food industry, in diapers.
Yes, in the insurance company, there are people that is their job. That is all that they do.
Is a risk manager, which is supposed to be the HACCP team leader, the HACCP team coordinator, the PCQI, and so on.
Yep. And so Teja has a very good comment here that kind of goes in this as well. So some companies say HACCP's done. All right, I've done my analysis.
HACCP is never done. To your point, it's never done because even insurance companies, I'm going to use that, insurance companies or banks, do they leave their hazard analysis alone? Okay, my hazard analysis done. Let's work with this. No, they update that database basically daily with all of the operations and everything that is going on. Because at the end, Bryan, something that we're also missing in the food industry is that when we're done with our hazard analysis, I don't care if it's at the beginning, we're done with analyzing something for risk. The fact that most of the controls implemented are not going to take the risk to zero, okay? There is always that is called a residual risk for each and every single control. But each and every single control that you put in place are just a tiny portion in the universe of your system. In our case, a food safety system. So we have elements, and that is fundamentally the definition of a system, a bunch of elements working together. each and every single element has many controls, because most of the controls in a system are not going to give you the zero. You will always have remaining residual risk. And because all of the elements must be interconnected, is it possible that at some point, just because of risk, just because of the uncertainty, you have a combination of different residual risk working together and getting into the tolerance that where FDA is going to say the product is adulterated? Yes, that is possible. But we don't have that vision.
Interesting. So I mean, this definitely, and keep the comments coming, guys, because they're so on point here. Is that one of the things that we're emphasizing here very strongly, right? Is risk is a projection into the future, right? It's not a backwards looking process. It's what insurance companies do, right? It's like, okay, here's what we project the risk is going to be for your car insurance over the next 6 months. Here's your premium based upon all of the data that they have. And it's the same in manufacturing as well. So it's why in your food safety plan, to the point it was made earlier, you just can't say, okay, I've created my food safety plan and everything is good. No. What does it say? The plan must be reviewed at least annually or when changes occur to the system.
I mean, even Bryan, I mean, there is nothing I can tell you, because even the frequencies that are defined for the reassessment of the HACCP or the reassessment of the food safety plan, even those frequencies, I mean, really, every 3 years or whenever deviations happen, why not taking a proactive approach and say, we are going to be reviewing the effectiveness of our controls to take care of the hazards on a daily basis, and use the data to continuously improve the way that we control those hazards. Why we're not doing this if everybody is doing this when they implement their own risk assessments?
Yeah.
And when I'm saying everybody, of course, I'm not talking about the food industry. I'm talking about insurance, banks, and very large corporations.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think this kind of gets into our next point, which is risk is not static, right? Risk is constantly changing. And it's part of the reason why with the locals group where I post recalls, and this is something I've been doing for years and years, is I track risk. And it's why I'm aware of enoki mushrooms, because I'm out there looking for things where risk changes. And it's just not simply the material, right? We tend to think of risk in terms of physical things. Okay, here's my product, here's what I'm making, here's my plant, here's my ingredients, etc. But it's also people, right? So if my quality manager, who's been in charge of my food safety plan in my production facility for the last 15 years, leaves, has my risk gone up? Yes, it has. Okay.
Yeah.
War breaks out and my supply chain is disrupted and I have to get new suppliers. Is my supply chain, has the risk just increased? Absolutely, right?
Yes.
The engineering group buys a brand new piece of equipment that they found somewhere on an auction site. Has my risk increased? Oh yeah, my risk has increased.
And let me add, simple things, Bryan. So you have you purchase a mixer, brand new, okay? And then you put it in the line and you start working with this equipment, okay? After, I'm just going to guess, 5 years, to say a number, okay? After 5 years, I bet you that the sanitary condition of the food contact surface is not the same as day number one. Because on a daily basis, the fact that we are cleaning, assuming that we're cleaning with a validated frequency, the fact that we're cleaning is going to start making the surface rougher.
Yes.
Allowing bacteria to attach better. And that is the natural consequence of we cleaning the equipment and food contact surfaces and tools and utensils and so on. Is anyone taking that into account?
Yeah.
Are we taking into account, like I remember BMW says the water pump of your car has 80,000 hours of operation or something like that. The amount of shelf life of the pump is defined by the manufacturer. So why manufacturers of equipment are not telling people, hey, you know what? My equipment is good for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever that is. And then you, number one, or resurface the equipment, or you just dump that equipment and purchase a new one.
Right. So in those terms, and I think that's a really brilliant observation, Jose, is sanitation is risk control. PM is risk control. Environmental monitoring is risk control.
Yep.
GMPs are risk control. Everything is risk control. The reason we continue doing these things over time is to reduce risk, right? It's like, oh no, I built the plant and everything is fine. I did my initial environmental monitoring and they all came back negative. I'm okay.
No.
No,
you know
no,
what,
no, you're
Bryan? That was, for me, was a challenge. So the challenge was to read the GNPs in 21 CFR 117, the Preventive Control for Human Food, subpart B. And I read, with calm, section by section of all of the requirements in the GNP. And I can tell you that most of them are designed to control hazards, not filth. Well, what about that? What about if those controls are not effective enough to take care of those hazards?
Yeah.
Are we evaluating the risk, the effectiveness of those controls? No. Why? Oh, because they're not HACCP. Really? Come on.
Right. So great comments, guys. So, there's some subjects, Jose, that are coming in here that are just too broad for our scope today. So I don't think we'll be able to address those, but they're very good. So keep them coming. So part of this is building the community around these type of things, right? So like Larry's talking about here, your supplier approval program, right? Is part of your risk analysis. Absolutely. Is there more risk with a new supplier versus a supplier you've been buying for with no issues for 20 years? Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And which overlays, thank you, Larry, into our next topic, which is risk is not a static element in and of itself. It's cumulative, right?
Yes.
So you have your supplier risk, plus your product risk, plus your personnel risk, and even seasonal risk, right? We know, for example, that pest activity goes up when the weather turns cold in the fall, right? Your risk has increased for an event in those areas. Risk is constantly changing, and these things are additive. They are not independent static elements, and you need to look at them as a group.
And what I'm going to say, Bryan, could be crazy, could be, but I'm going to the extreme now. It is extremely likely that for each element of the system, you need a risk matrix. So the way that you rate the presence or absence of pest determines certain severity. You need a risk matrix for pest control. Oh, like Duncan was saying, preventive maintenance. Preventive maintenance, you're going to have a different risk assessment, because the same way that we may allow the inclusion of sweat from the mechanics, which is not going to cause illness or injury most likely, we also may have the inclusion of metal. Now, in the case that we have sweat, is the product adulterated? Yes. Is that a hazard? No. If maintenance is not properly performed and there is a 0.001 millimeter piece of a stainless steel 316, which is a material that is 100% approved to be used in contact with food, what is the risk of that? Nobody's going to get harmed. There is no hazard there. Is the product adulterated? Yes, it is. because metal is not food.
Right.
And I don't care about the size, and I don't care about the shape, and I don't care about the material. The product is by default adulterated legally.
Right.
So our assessment of the severity should be taking into consideration not only the consequence, the bad consequence of a hazard, should also take into consideration the fact that certain things will make the products adulterated. And they're not hazards.
So Duncan has an interesting comment here. Fallacy. You might switch. Let me put this up here. You might switch to a new supplier who's coincidentally lower risk. It's only your perceived risk that's guaranteed to move upwards, right? I mean, so part of this is gathering your data. Because really around this, and this is something that we talk about here on the chat quite a bit, I think this is a good point to mention this, is the documentation is fine and it's needed. But the most important part, and we know this as auditors and consultants, is tell me why. Okay, here's what we've identified. Why? Why did you identify that? Right? You need to be able to, and the shorthand terminology I use for this is tell your story. Why did I decide that this was a risk? Or also just as important, why did I decide this is not a risk? Right?
Yep.
Appendix 1 is meant as guidance, right? And the FDA is very clear on that. This is a starting point of things that you should consider. It doesn't mean it's mandatory. And if any FDA investigator or auditor or anybody tells you that it is, they're wrong. They are wrong. But for some risk, there's such a body of evidence that it is a risk. Good luck trying. You're wasting your time trying to move away from that. All right. Listeria soft ripened cheeses. Yes, a risk. Okay. Unless you come up with a novel new way of manufacturing that removes that risk, you need to consider that. But you could, right? Maybe there's a new type of manufacturing that removes the risk. I don't know. Could be.
Yeah. So following up on the approved suppliers, another example. Okay. So I'm going to analyze the risk of a supplier that because they are grinding flour, there is a potential for metal inclusion. Okay, fine. Let's say that we receive flour and the flour contains a bunch of 0.01 millimeter of metal. Okay. Is that a hazard? No. You're going to eat that and nobody's going to realize that you eat it. Is that a hazard? Is the product adulterated? Yes, it is. Why is it adulterated? Because metal do not fit into the definition of food in the law. Right. Okay? That's a reason why it's adulterated. Okay? But it's not a hazard. So, if you go to the law, and the law says that it is prohibited to ship a product that is adulterated, and if flour contains 0.01 millimeter of metal, it's not food. Is that product adulterated, that flour adulterated? Yes, it is. Can the supplier, can the mill ship the product? No. If they ship the product, they are committed a crime. If the facility that is receiving the flour accepts the product saying, well, you know what? The pieces are too small and they're not hazards. So now nobody's going to get, harm or ill or something like that because I'm going to call the guy and say, hey, you need to be just careful. You're committing another crime because receiving product that is adulterated is prohibited. So the problem that we have right now, after, all of these things, crazy things that I've been doing lately, is that we are limiting our vision of this risk assessment to only hazards. And we're not looking at the entire picture that we have in front of us, which is the adulteration and the misbranding.
Right. Well, and everything that we're talking about here that is related to our production facility, right? So I'm a quality manager in a plant and I'm responsible for all these things we're talking about, also applies to your suppliers. There's another quality manager who is going through that same process at the supplier, and they should be looking at risk the same way you do. Are they? Right. I think that's why FDA, when they put together FSMA, elevated supplier control to the level of preventive control, because they realized just how important that is for controlling risk.
And even at that point, Bryan, and I mean, this is something that I realized when I took the class for lawyers, for food lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at how FSMA, the actual Food Safety Modernization Act law, was written, and you go to the section of the definitions, you do have the definition of a critical limit. The only way that you define critical limit in the law is because is acceptable. But when we are teaching the class, you only can have now process preventive controls. Why deviating from someone that was already in place for 50, 60 years? Why not saying your hazard plans, they're fine, they're good, you can keep them, make sure that you're updated constantly, but we have other sources of significant hazards that we need to control.
Mm-hmm.
And then call those other things preventive control, because that is exactly the way that is written in the law.
Yeah. So this just came to my mind as well, too. So we all know the phrase reasonably likely to occur.
Yes.
What is another word for that? Risk.
Yes. Yes. And hold on, Bryan. Reasonably likely to occur in the future.
Touche. So something else that we talked about when we were preparing for this chat as well, too, is contingency planning, right? So, for example, we'll use the hurricane, the recent example here in Florida, right? So you see the potential course of the storm, right? Which is a projection of risk into the future. And if you're in a very high risk, so Tampa, oh crap, I got to get out of here, unless you're the crazy guy on the boat who stayed. But you're looking at it from your perspective too, right? So you're like, okay, I'm in Miami. It's projected to go in this direction. As you deviate from that course, right, the actual statistical likelihood of that happening goes down. And yes, you made a personal risk assessment of your contingency planning around how you are going to react to that hurricane, right?
Yep. So that's a very good point, Bryan. You know what? So I've been living in the US for 20-something years.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning, when we have hurricanes touching in other parts of Florida, we fundamentally never had a tornado. 20 years ago, never heard about that. Okay. Maybe they happen. I'm not saying that they never happen. Maybe they happen, but we were not aware of this. So when Milton came in, same thing, very far from us and whatever. And then you say, you know what? It's not going to be a big deal because it's touching very far and we may receive a gust of winds of 40 miles per hour, maybe 50. And basically it's not a big deal. But now climate change, we have the formation of tornadoes. And this year we have the highest strength tornado in the history of Florida. It was an EF3 in my county, in Broward County.
Wow.
So what about that? Can I just perform a hazard analysis and then develop a contingency plan and not updating the plan according to the risk? No, because the risk is changing constantly.
Right. Well, and part of that too is tools for detection change over time, right? So
yes,
the forecasting tools and the satellites and everything that we have now, much more sophisticated than they were 20 years ago.
Yes.
So our ability to see the risk has improved. Now, part of that as well is if an insurance company came to me and said, hey, Bryan, would you like to buy some hurricane insurance in Colorado? No. Right? How have I reached that conclusion, Jose?
Yeah. There is evidence, Brian, that, I mean, that person has no clue about what risk is.
Yeah.
Because it's not an event that may happen to you.
Right. In the future.
In the future.
Right. So
no, I'm going to say, I don't know, because of climate change, sometime you may get a hurricane over there in the future.
Well, and now we're back to our shorthand term, methodology for this: severity and likelihood.
Yes.
The likelihood of a hurricane happening in Colorado, 1 in a million years. Right.
Oh, okay. Yes.
It's still there, and the severity would be huge. Right. Odds are that if it hits my house, it's gone. Right. But I'm willing to take that risk over time.
I mean, it's about us, and I'm going to use the name that I believe is the right name, is the risk assessor. Is not anymore HACCP trained person. It's not about PCQI. No, it's a risk assessor. It's the person that is fully understanding the events, the consequences of those events, which could be hazards or could be adulteration with things that may not or will not cause illness or injury. Okay, both of those things are adulteration. Adulteration is prohibited by law. And then when we decide the way that we're going to control that, we assign a risk factor, a risk number, a risk ranking, or you call it as you wish, and we set up a control. We still need to keep evaluating constantly the severity and the likelihood in time to see how that risk moves up or down and adjust our controls according to that.
Mm-hmm. So Duncan's talking a little bit here about what we're talking about in this portion of the chat as well, which is contingency planning. So back to the hurricane analogy. So even though for this particular event, the likelihood of it happening to you was relatively low, you still had contingency plans, right?
Yeah.
All right. Is my car full of gas? Yes. Do I have emergency food? Yes. Do I have somewhere I can go if I need to? Yes. Right. You prepare, even though, right, it appears in that particular event that the risk is low, you're still prepared.
Yep. Yep. So contingency. I agree with you. But look at the sequence, Brian. You have an event. You have an adulterant. I don't want to call any more hazard. You have an adulterant. Okay. You analyze the consequence. I don't want to say any more severity, because when you're not analyzing hazards, you just need to analyze the consequence. You analyze the consequence. You analyze the probability. You identify the risk. According to the risk, you set up a control that you expect that is going to reduce that risk to an acceptable level, because most of our controls are not going to get the zero.
Right.
They're going to just reduce the hazard, the adulterant, to an acceptable level. So at that point is when you're going to say, do we need contingency if we already know that we reduced to an acceptable level? And the answer is yes. And you know why? Because the black swans still happen.
Yes.
Without you knowing and understanding what's going on. So do you need to have some contingency planning? What happens if even after I'm doing all of these things, something happens out of the blue and I'm getting to this problem? How can I cope with that situation? How can I minimize the impact on the financials of the company, the reputation of the company, the reputation of the brand, and so on?
Right. That's why we have backup suppliers, right?
Yes. Yes, especially for those ingredients that are being used a lot. Because if you say, well, I'm manufacturing one product that I make 500 pounds and it's once per year and they're using this ingredient, well, maybe you may have one. It's not that big of a deal. But if you're using one ingredient for all of your ingredients on a daily basis, oh, you better have 2 or 3 or 4 different suppliers.
Right. And that's also a risk assessment. So if you have a large volume ingredient, backup suppliers. If you have a proprietary ingredient that you can only buy from one source, risk, right? So you better be looking at that closer. So let's bring this back to the $1 million question around this, Jose, with 5 minutes left here. Is senior management. Oh my goodness. Right. So this is a very complicated subject that we're talking about here today. How do you communicate this to senior management?
Okay. So quick overview about this, Bryan, because really this has a lot of different branches. But I'm going to take it easy and I'm going to give you an overview. Whomever decides to create a company, not to make food, Bryan, companies are created to make money. And we need to be very clear about this. I'm very clear about this. I'm a food safety consultant. I'm an instructor for food safety, but companies are designed to make money because nobody's going to invest the time and the effort and eventually the money in doing something not to get a return, period. Right. Okay? This is basic knowledge. With that in mind, whomever is that person that has the vision or group of people, could be a board, their job is to, number one, create a vision. Yeah, and Cortland is saying the partner tree. We're getting there, Cortland. So they have a vision. They create a mission on how to achieve the vision. They create the values that they would like the company to have. They create the objectives of the company, and those objectives are money, not food safety. Okay, I'm talking about the structure of a company. So now when the company gets the values and gets the organizational chart and what we're going to do, and these are the pros, whatever, from senior management, each and every single department of the company is supposed to be creating objectives for their own activities. Those objectives should be aligned with the general objective of the company, which is make money. Yeah. What is the problem in the case of food companies? That the objectives of senior management, which is making money, cannot go against the legal requirements in the law. You cannot produce adulterated product. You cannot ship adulterated product. You cannot receive adulterated products. And you cannot reduce the frequency of cleaning just because cleaning is too expensive, because the company is going to be working under insanitary conditions, and that is prohibited by law. So unless senior management has a very clear understanding of the legal requirements, they cannot perform. The company is going like, one of those chickens that you cut the head and they start running. Like, well, that's exactly what is going on in the food business.
Right. Well, and it gets back to the beginning of our conversation and the phrase that I hate, which is we never had a problem before. And so hopefully now you have an understanding of why that phrase is so important. And if you get that response from senior management, your risk in that company has just gone up.
Whoop. Yes. Yep.
So good comments here, guys. Wow. And so part of this, right, and we'll kind of bring our chat here a close today. And so part of this and the challenge for this, and I'll apologize to everybody on our chat here today, is very limited amount of time to cover a very big topic. And so part of this is starting the conversation, and we got so many smart people in our chat here today who are asking very detailed and deep questions that we just don't have time to address, which is why, guys, we have the email addresses on here, right? Is obviously Jose is leading the pack on this and getting a ton of information and taking us in the direction, because that's one of the things in food safety and in what we do. We're leading the vision in the company, and it doesn't do you any good to compile this information and then just keep it to yourself. You have to be able to communicate this, which is why we ended the chat with today of how do you communicate this to senior management. You need to make sure that they understand this, because part of this too, Jose, is a lot of times one of the flaws in senior management at food companies, right, is back to your point, their objective is to make money. So they bring in people who make money. That does not mean that they know food.
There you go.
So you have to teach them, right? If you bring in a CEO from an automotive company, they may understand FEMA, but they don't understand food risk. So you have to work with them and teach them and educate them and become their valued advisor on helping them to understand these risks so they can make the right decisions. Because risk cannot be evaluated without knowledge, right?
Yes.
Impossible, right? So you have to teach.
Bryan, the risk assessors in banks and insurance company, they talk to the board and they talk to the owner and they talk to the president of the company. They talk to the highest position. Really? Are you going to have as a team leader, the PCQI talking to the owner of the company and say, hey, we should be cleaning more? That is the expectation. But nobody's doing it.
Risk. Perfect summary. Wow. Fantastic chat. I'm going to be thinking about this all week. Thank you, Jose, for sharing this information with us and making food safety better. And thank you to everybody here in the audience and with us and participating in our chat today. Thank you for investing your time in this. Well worth it. And just by understanding a little bit more about this knowledge, you're reducing risk as well. So that's a good thing. So with that, we're going to close out our chat here for today. So ponder this information, but also have a good weekend. Enjoy yourself and revel in your knowledge and your expertise and how you're helping to make everyone safer and reducing risk. So we will join everybody for the next food safety chat on Friday next week at the same time, of course, at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern on X and YouTube. And well, no, we're not doing X right now, just YouTube and LinkedIn, where we live stream and answer your questions. And we'll see you back there then. So thank you. Gosh, Jose, fantastic. Really appreciate it. I love it when I have you on. And thank you, everybody. Have a great one, and we'll talk soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye, guys.